Deliver Us from Evil is a movie that I should love. I was excited when I saw the trailer. However, after seeing the film, I was disappointed. Although, to be completely honest, I fell asleep the first time I watched it. I rented it from Redbox and watched it with my mom and at the time girlfriend. Therefore, I didn't remember much from it. Fast forward half a decade, the film is on in the background during a family function, and I see Eric Bana as a police officer, detective, and a villain that looked a lot like one of the villains from Condemned to Bloodshot, a favorite game of mine back in the PlayStation 3 days. Needless to say, this movie had a lot of promise, combining several elements we've seen countless times into something kind of unique. In addition to all of this flick is based on a true story. That's a detail that I'll touch on later. Deliver Us from Evil is a film that I should have loved. This movie became even more disappointing to me following the release of Longlegs. I am a huge fan of The X-Files and Supernatural. Seven, The Prisoners, Zodiac, and The Batman are some of my favorite films of all time. The 2016 film called The Void, directed by Jeremy Gillespie and Steven Kostanski, is the subject of my indulgence. I am drawn to detective stories that borderline on police procedural. A story I really want to see played out is a normal cop like the cops in Seven or Zodiac investigating a homicide or string of crimes that twist into the supernatural realm. An ordinary detective or cop dealing with something they're not quite qualified or equipped to deal with. Something with that quasi Lovecraftian element sewn into it. I think of video games like Resident Evil 1, where you play as a specially trained police squad similar to the SWAT, investigating a mansion that turns out to be infested with biological organic weapons like zombies and mutants. I've always found the backstory to the events of that game very interesting. A bunch of detectives and cops investigating a brutal and bizarre series of murders in the mountains where that mansion is located. I think of Resident Evil 2, where you play as a rookie police officer finding himself in the middle of a zombie and mutant outbreak. I'm reminded of the first Evil Within, where you play as police detectives who find themselves in the middle of some reality bending supernatural horror. The first biggest aspect of the movie I found alluring was that it reminded me of Condemned to Bloodshot. Condemned to Bloodshot, the sequel to Condemned Criminal Origins, is a psychological supernatural crime thriller. The main villain of Deliver Us from Evil is Jungler, and upon seeing him, I felt a surge of nostalgia and excitement. Jungler looked virtually the same as Inferi from Condemned to Bloodshot. This movie has almost everything going for it that it should have been cemented as one of my favorite films, detective films, and supernatural horror films of all time. But it doesn't stick the landing. It falls so flat and it feels flat. I approve of the aspects of the movie regarding the detective and police elements. The best way to sum up how the movie is comes from a review from Games Brains and a Headbanging Life. Since the release of The Exorcist in 1973, the film industry has developed something of an obsession with the movies surrounding demonic possessions and exorcisms. More and more continue to be made. However, I am not saying that every single one of them is bad, because when done right, with some creativity and an attempt at originality, it could still be quite an effective subject matter in horror, but it's very rare. The film has some potential with the blending of veteran NYPD officers against a supernatural being. There is definitely an intriguing story in there somewhere. That's really how I can best describe how I felt about the movie. It had some potential to do something original and scary, but ultimately failed to do so. There's entertainment to be had with this film, but I was hoping for more. Deliver Us from Evil fails to deliver on its potential, and instead delivers an average, thoroughly generic exorcism movie. There's much more to the review, but that's all stuff I'll touch on later. To really emphasize the point I'm trying to make, let me state one more time. Deliver Us from Evil is a movie that should be good given its unique setting and premise. Instead, the movie feels a bit dull, and the reasons for this are overt. The review that I gave you snippets of describes this very well. On Rotten Tomatoes, the critic score is 29%, and the audience score is 42%. So, when you see a consistent score on both sides, it's probably a good indicator that the movie is not very good. Despite the unique premise, it's woven together by generic plot points with very little inspiration and ultimately culminates in an abrupt, how the heck do we conclude this movie, bombastic ending. The movie depicts Ralph Sarchi as a family man. He tries to attend his daughter's soccer games. He tries to be a good husband. However, there's two problems. A, he's a cop. B, he works graveyard. As anyone who works or has worked a graveyard or even worked swing shift knows, these shifts oftentimes require you to sacrifice family time, social gatherings, and after school activities. However, some jobs that are specialized, entry level, or high paying oftentimes fall on graveyard. As a result of this, Ralph is slowly becoming estranged from his wife. And this is where that generic trope, which unfortunately is all too common among ungrateful spouses and families, but is depicted in every movie ever. The father, Ralph, is a bad dad and a bad husband because he has a job and he's really good at it. And that pays the bills, like the mortgage and other utilities. And as a result of his specialized and important job, he misses some of the daughter's games and presumably other functions. Now, more understandably, Ralph is kind of being weighed down by the stress of his job. He's a bit detached. And to be fair, when we meet him, he's trying to resuscitate a baby that he pulled out of the dumpster. He then, after that, responds to a domestic disturbance call and quickly finds that the domestic disturbance is more akin to domestic violence. Eventually, the domestic abuser flees and the cops chase him down. Of course, our heroes catch up to him, and Ralph begins to punch the fleeing suspect out of a fit of rage. It's clear the job is getting to our main character. However, to me, this whole beginning part of the movie, despite being the typical and necessary day in the life of our main character, while also giving us important info about our characters' personalities, screams generic. Usually, pulling a baby out of a dumpster would be and should be extreme and unsettling. But to me, this came off as on the nose and screamed, "Look, this is a good guy." I couldn't take it seriously. And then we lead right into the generic male hero white knighting by beating the crap out of domestic abusers to protect women. Morally, I don't have qualms with this. Right now, we have cardboard cutouts of athletic men who do the right thing. We're supposed to care for them because they're heroes. Compare this with the opening of The Walking Dead. When we're introduced to our main characters, we see right off the bat that they're both cops. We don't need to see them doing something heroic. Rather, the story is establishing that their friendship is key. We know they're heroic already because 1, they're cops, 2, they're showing a great deal of empathy and care towards one another. After that was established, then we get to see them be heroic and attempt to stop the bad guys. I don't know why, but I can't take the priest seriously when we're introduced to him. We're supposed to assume that he has a past where he strayed away from God, but now he's a righteous man fighting his vices. I feel as if it comes off as cringe. But we see this all the time with stoic and or moral characters, that they either resist vices like attractive women because they're stoic and moral, or they partake in vices because they're so heroic and manly. That may just be my personal bias speaking, but I can't help but shake it. We get the generic scene where Sarchi is watching his daughter's soccer game, which is fine. This tells us that he has a family. This is a day in the life scene that we need to see to help us establish his normal circumstances. The priest is just kind of hanging around the precinct because he's convinced that a woman, our two main characters arrested, is possessed by a demon. This is another aspect in which the movie for me just doesn't work. The movie has good and decent actors, but the chemistry just isn't there, and they don't work well off of each other. For example, I'm not convinced that the priest actually believes anything he is saying, because to me it feels like he's delivering his lines as if he's reading a teleprompter. The dynamic between Sarchi and his partner, Butler, feels soulless, like I'm watching a feature length porno movie or something. The way they react to each other and interact seems very feigned. I just can't buy into it. The hero yells at his kid for being a kid because he's stressed due to his job. At Sarchi's home, you get generic objects moving and toys coming to life. To me, it doesn't fit with the pacing of the movie. It's not unbelievable to me or out of place that a demon would move objects, but it feels like another generic haunted house movie. This movie tries to cleverly weave the Doors band into the plot, and it acts as an analogy or metaphor for Sarchi's radar abilities. Basically, our boy Sarchi can sense when there are demonic shenanigans afoot. Basically, he has the shine. Sarchi's partner barely bats an eye when the priest joins the duo. Butler basically adds nothing to the story other than giving us exposition through dialogue about Sarchi's radar. Butler has a very unceremonious and forced death. It's funny because nothing about this fight indicates to me that Butler should be tired. It looks like he just kind of gives up and he appears to be indifferent about his looming demise. Supernatural and other CW shows have more dramatic and convincing fights with better tension. We get the generic flashback scene of our hero's problematic past. You see, he's just so moral that he loses his shit and beats a child murderer to a bloody pulp. This is my bias coming through, but I cringe so hard. The tough hero who just beats people half to death with a few exceptions. If this character trait isn't depicted well, it comes off as an edgelord tough guy fantasy. This can be done well. It's done well on the Daredevil Netflix series, now on Disney Plus. It's done well at the end of the Batman when Batman injects venom and beats a guy's face in to defend Catwoman. It's done well when Shane loses his shit in season 1 and when Rick loses his shit in Alexandria. In this, it's bad. First, the child is murdered and is placed in a trash can, but then there's this cop just casually sitting there relaxing. I'm sure on the job in real life, you'll have cops nonchalantly chilling at crime scenes when they're just guarding the area. But in a movie, it looks off. Then instead of the cop notifying other cops that the killer that's wanted showed back up to revel in his handiwork, instead decides to just run off and start a foot chase. Sure, you could say that his anger drove him into irrational blind vengeance, but it just doesn't work. The movie really begins to suffer towards the end. It feels like they didn't know how to end it. Sarchi's family is kidnapped, and in order to find out where they are, they perform an exorcism on the demon. How do they find and capture this dangerous demon that's possessing a soldier with combat experience? Well, he's just waiting at Sarchi's house. You know, this dangerous demon that killed Sarchi's adrenaline junkie partner. The demon just lets itself get arrested. To be fair, I guess it is the case that demons aren't just physical foes. They try to seduce you and turn you away from God. But to me, it's not really clear what it's trying to do to Sarchi. And up until now, they really played this demonic threat as a physical threat. Then the scene where he finds his family is done poorly. It's not good at all. There's music playing in the background, so you can't really hear any panic or frantic police searching. Our protagonist just finds his family. This scene should have emanated tension and suspense. Instead, it feels like we're just rushing to the ending. It's not all bad. There are some things I did like. I love the movie's aesthetic. It depicts the dark and gloomy urban environment, apartments with dark painted walls, lived in cramped places, alleyways, heavy rain, and mundane feel of everyday life that I'm accustomed to considering I'm from Portland. Portland is no New York City, but when you're in the middle of the concrete jungle, it really doesn't matter. This is what it's like. I do like the early feel of the film with the detective element. The zoo scene, which introduces us to some subtle supernatural elements, is fantastic. The look of the antagonist and some of the supernatural elements, akin to The Conjuring or Insidious, is pretty awesome when it's not overly generic. To understand this film, we have to look at the director, Scott Derrickson. On one hand, he wrote and or directed great movies like Doctor Strange and The Black Phone. He's been at the helm of generally good or competent movies like Sinister, Land of Plenty, and The Exorcist of Emily Rose. However, he has also had duds like The Day the Earth Stood Still, Devil's Knot, and Sinister 2. So, what I gather from his filmography is that Scott is a brilliant filmmaker, but a hit and miss writer. Deliver Us from Evil is one of his misses. Now, I need to address the elephant in the room. Since I talked about the director, I need to talk about the source material before the film was made. The beginning of the movie starts off with text stating that the movie is inspired by the actual accounts of NYPD Sergeant Ralphie Sarchi. The movie poster even reads inspired by the actual accounts of an NYPD sergeant. Of course, this isn't the first nor the last horror film or supernatural horror film that has claimed to be inspired by or based on true events. Any movie that depicts any event involving Ed and Lorraine Warren, such as The Conjuring, The Haunting in Connecticut, Annabelle, and of course films like Amityville Horror, The Exorcism of Emily Rose, Poltergeist, and The Exorcist fall into the category. I'll even throw Fire in the Sky into the mix. However, the thing about those movies is that they are so isolated to specific houses and specific individuals. Where Deliver Us from Evil differs is that it is so bombastic by comparison. It's not just an isolated house that's being haunted or an isolated and possessed individual. This film involves active law enforcement. Other films have had elements where law enforcement get involved, but Deliver Us from Evil is about law enforcement dealing with the supernatural. Multiple haunted locations are depicted and multiple possessed people are shown. So I was wondering to myself, how in the hell has this never been made before? The Exorcist, the Annabelle doll, the Amityville Horror are so ingrained in the cultural zeitgeist that everyone basically is aware of these events to some extent. So I wondered, how in the hell have we never heard about this bombastic supernatural story involving an actual investigation and demonic possession? I mean, I kind of suspected the answer. These events didn't actually happen, but still, I was curious. Usually there's some sort of event that happened, or person who is claiming such events took place. This led me to discovering the book that Deliver Us from Evil is based on. I bought the book and read it without any prior research. Considering the movie poster and trailer all advertise that the movie is based on the book, and the newer printings of the book, retitled from Beware the Night to Deliver Us from Evil to match the movie, have the tagline claiming it has now been adapted into a major motion picture, I figured the book would be similar to the movie, maybe even better. Boy, was I wrong. I'm not surprised, and to be honest, I should have assumed that the book was going to be nothing like the movie, or the movie wasn't anything like the book. I remember when watching the movie that there's no way any of this stuff happened. Otherwise, it would be common knowledge that demons and ghosts exist. After all, a man possessed by a demon went around evading the police, even killing one, as well as doing supernatural stuff on camera. This would be national news. After all, the grainiest footage imaginable showing the slightest bit of unexplained phenomena goes viral. But this didn't? Suffice it to say that nothing in the movie is really presented in the book. Beware the Night, also known as Deliver Us from Evil, written by Ralph Sarchie and Lisa Collier-Cool. You see, the movie was boring because it was generic and didn't live up to my high expectations for it. The book, on the other hand, was repetitive and didn't tell a story. Instead, each part of the book depicted smaller contained stories about Ralph Sarchie performing exorcisms. Deliver Us from Evil tells the story of multiple exorcisms that took place over a span of several years. Sometimes the investigation and interview of the victimized family, as well as the exorcism, would take place over one chapter. Sometimes it would take place over 2 or even 3 chapters, but each story was more of the same. You might get some background detail from Ralph Sarchie about how badass and tough he is as a New York City cop, the criminals he dealt with, his relationship to Ed and Lorraine Warren, some supernatural experiences he had, how the demonic interfered in his marriage, and how he strayed from God for a period of time. There are quite a few analogies that Ralph draws between his time dealing with the human scum element as a cop and dealing with the diabolical evil as an exorcist and paranormal investigator. I was really bummed out when I got to the 3rd chapter. I had high hopes with chapter names like The Halloween Horror, Cops and Soul Robbers, The Satanic Stalker, and The Werewolf. But I was bored about a quarter of the way through the book. I had to rush to the finish for the sake of this video. I really feel like the movie, aside from the main character's name, just took the subtitle from the book, A New York City Cop Investigates the Supernatural, and ran with it. There are so few similarities, it is egregious that they could even make any claim whatsoever that the movie is based on true events or based on the book. Of course, selling the rights to the book means more money, and associating the movie with the book means more book sales, potentially. Like I stated previously, the name of the main character is the main similarity. However, after that, there's not much. In the book, there's no law enforcement activity at all. There are a few analogies here and there, but the law enforcement aspect, Ralph being an NYPD police sergeant, is entirely played up to add credibility to stories that the book tells. It's a common tactic to use when paranormal videos or events allegedly happen to cite the person's profession and authority to lend credibility. The book is about Ralph Sarchie's off-duty dabbling in the supernatural world. Now, this isn't a secret for those who dig in, so I will have to give them credit. Those who look for behind-the-scenes stuff for film or love to investigate based on true story, demon, ghost, haunting films, or incidents will probably find this very easily. But for the average moviegoer or the average person who sees based on a true story, this isn't the case. But it isn't that hard to find information about whether or not the movie is actually based on true events. For example, in an interview with Complex.com by Matt Barone, the interviewer, and the director Scott Derrickson, he asked him about adapting the alleged real events into a movie. Matt asks, Though Deliver Us from Evil is based on Ralph Sarchi's real life experiences, there's a lot of fictionalization involved, from setting the film in the present day to the story's supernatural throughline and demonic presence. When writing a screenplay like this, is it difficult to both honor the real person's life story while letting your imagination run wild? And Scott, the director, answered by saying, I've really run up against the challenge of that quite a few times. Emily Rose was based on a real story, and the real girl died, and there were surviving members of the family. So I took the concerns of that very seriously. When I wrote the early draft of Devil's Knot, I was really concerned about it because the West Memphis Three were still in jail, and I didn't want to fictionalize anything. In this case, I had the good fortune of being able to run everything by Ralph. His memoir, Beware the Night, which he wrote and Jerry Bruckheimer fought for me to adapt, is a bunch of individual cases. They're not connected at all. So I just took elements from what I thought were the most interesting cases and tied them together with a fictional narrative. I told Ralph I was going to do that and said, look, this is going to be a real blend of fact and fiction, but I'm going to get you right, which I think I did. It's the real Ralph Sarchi, how he thinks, how he talks, what he does, how he's changed as a person as a result of the stuff he does. The main storyline is fictional, and I had to do that in order to make it work as a movie. So, they're not exactly lying, but for the average moviegoer, they're not going to find this information. And with what the director said, that is exactly what the film is. I read the book and instantly recognized some of the scenes in the book that were lifted and put into the movie. And to be honest, that is where the movie succeeds the most. In the book, there's no possessed villain that the police are chasing. There's no incident in a zoo where the antagonist walks by a lion without provoking it or eliciting any sort of reaction. Ralph's partner didn't die from a demon possessed criminal. There was no exorcism in the police station. The book reads like smaller scale Ed and Lorraine investigations and exorcisms. Demons trick people by manipulating them into believing they're ghosts. People see apparitions, hear strange noises, objects are moved, objects are flung towards the walls, demons speak through people, etc. Eric Bana has Ralph Sarchi's accent down to a T. In the movie, Ralph's marriage is struggling. In the book, Ralph does state that the demonic impacted his marriage. He's divorced. The priest is a fictional character and is supposedly an amalgamation of two real life religious leaders by the name of Bishop McKenna and Father Malachi Martin. The radar in the movie, where Ralph is able to tell when a call would be adrenaline inducing, is apparently akin to Ralph's realized sense when spiritual evil is present. He's experienced splitting headaches in the presence of the devil's kin. Butler, Ralph's partner, is not a real person. The closest is Joe Forrester, his partner in spiritual investigations. As for the lion instance I brought up earlier, while there's no scene like that in the book, there is a Bible verse from 1 Peter chapter 5 verse 8. Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. The book was disappointing. I had to do my best to trudge through the most boring and repetitive series of stories imaginable. Each story was more of the same. The only difference is the subject of the stories. In some cases, it's a student, an average Joe, a family, etc. I was hoping that the book would be as bombastic as the movie, but it wasn't. All in all, the movie was disappointing. I loved the aesthetic. However, overall film falls flat and feels generic. It had some good ideas between the supernatural police procedural and demon possessed antagonists. The sprinkled in haunted house scenes were, again, generic and didn't fit the rest of the movie. None of the characters had any chemistry whatsoever, and the movie was rife with wooden acting. The ending was rushed and anticlimactic. The based on a true story tag seems a bit too stretched or used too loosely to really apply here. I mean, some scenes are lifted from the book in the most rudimentary sense. I think Longlegs had a much better execution when combining the police procedural elements with demonic supernatural horror. I wish this movie was better. I wish the book was more entertaining and less dry. And that pretty much sums up what I have to say about this movie and its supposed book that inspired the movie. I hope you all have a great day.